I'm Lincoln Rice of the Casa Maria Catholic Worker in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I wanted to share a little bit about the work that we do supporting families who have open cases with Child Protective Services. And this is something that Casa Maria began to become more involved with, especially in the year 2015. We decided to dedicate one of our houses to specifically be a place for mothers who are trying to get their kids back. So some moms have already had their kids removed and are trying to get them back, and some moms are staying there who have their kids who just got them back, but have, in both cases, they have conditions that they need to be fulfilling, court dates, classes, and a number of other things that could impede them from holding a job and trying to support their family and get their kids back at the same time. So oftentimes people ask us why we're involved with this issue. And it started, at least the first case that really hit home for me was a little bit before 2015, when we had a mother with triplets who was staying at Casa Maria. And she also had a teenage son who was just a real wonderful soul and a real gentle person, and always helped out with the other kids around the house, and just a pleasure to be around and have there. And her three kids, the triplets that were about 3 months old, all got sick at the same time. They were throwing up, they weren't keeping food down, and she wasn't sure about, she was trying to do anything she could to try to get them to keep food down. And the second day that they were sick, she even tried giving them a little bit of hard food, which is they'd be a little too young for, and they threw that up just like everything else. And so then she brought them to the hospital on the second day, and they had a fever, and basically they just had the flu. The doctor confirmed that and hydrated the kids. And in this case, the doctor also said it was inappropriate for you to give hard food to children this young, and so I'm going to have to report your situation to Child Protective Services. And so they came out and removed her children, deeming that she didn't know how to appropriately care for young children. And at that point, that's when we first cleared out a space at one of our houses for her to stay longer term so she could handle her case. And she did eventually get the triplets back, but it took about what the average time is for a mom to get her kids back once they're removed, and that's about 22 months. So, from 3 months to these kids were almost a little over 2 years old is how long it took for her to get her kids back. And, at Casa Maria, where, depending on which worker, we have some of the workers live directly in the house where most of the families live, and I live down the block, but as a family that I'd gotten to know, and people who lived in the house knew that this was a wonderful mom, and that this was a tragedy that should have never happened. So it caused us all to start looking more seriously at this issue. So that's kind of the first instance that brought us into the issue. Just to talk a little bit, the other thing that I feel is very important with that first story I shared but hadn't shared yet is that this mother was African American, and it just begs the question, in the same situation, if a mother from a suburb of Milwaukee who was white had gone in there, would the doctor have felt the need to report this situation? And then if the mother had been white and the doctor had reported the situation, would the CPS investigator have made the same decision? It just seems that her race and her life situation, but I'd say especially her race, played a prominent role in this. And that's borne out in the numbers that we have when it comes to Child Protective Services in America, which some activists who are involved in the area refer to as family or child policing, where a black family is when a CPS investigator comes out to determine if the child has been a victim of child maltreatment, meaning there's a substantiated allegation of abuse, in those cases, if the family is Black, the family is twice as likely to, the CPS investigator is twice as likely to determine that there is an allegation of child neglect or abuse. And for Black families, then the next step is, should the child be removed? And for Black families in the United States, you're 3 times as likely to have your child removed if compared to white families. So one of the narratives that's also began at when COVID, when the pandemic began in 2020, was as schools closed down, we're going to see greatly increasing rates in child neglect and abuse. And if we didn't see those rates, it was only because teachers weren't there to report on those rates. But now we do have the numbers for 2020, and we know that in 2019, the year before the pandemic, children who are believed to have died from neglect or abuse totaled 1,830 children. Maltreatment deaths for the following year, 2020, for which much of school was closed for many students who were at home. Child deaths that year that were suspected to be caused by abuse or neglect were 750. So we actually saw the number of child deaths for neglect or suspected neglect go down by about 80 children, 80 deaths. So a year that you could say we largely didn't have CPS working in the United States because they couldn't hear from mandatory reporters, we saw the numbers drop, which seemed to solidify in my mind what I've thought and suspected all along, is that CPS isn't really doing much to protect children. It's doing much more to harm families and separate families. There are a few more things I just wanted to share about this to fill in the picture a bit more and to show the discrepancy and between states when it comes to how they decide if something is child neglect or abuse, or if it's safe for a child to return home to their parent. So here's just a couple comparison statistics when it comes to children that are removed from the home. So actually the state that has the fewest children removed, and the way that they give out this statistic is to say, with that state population, how many children per 1,000 did this happen to in that state? So in New Jersey, 2.2 children were removed per 1,000. And in West Virginia, 19 children were removed per 1,000. So if these statistics could actually be used to discern helpful information, we would know that parents are about 8 times more dangerous in the state of West Virginia. If we look at reunification numbers, parents that after that 22 months get their kids back, in the state of Delaware, there's only a 24% reunification rate. So if your kids are removed, only 24% of parents actually get reunited with their kids. In South Carolina, the reunification rate is 77%. So if we wanted to take this seriously, we would say, well, in Delaware, parents don't know how to get their act together, and that's why they're not getting their kids back. And in South Carolina, we have people that really know how to get their act together, and that's why they're 3 times more likely to get their children back than in Delaware. But I think it probably doesn't make sense to most of us. If we think of Delaware, we probably don't think of it as like one of the worst parenting states in the country. So why has this issue also become a raced issue? We see foster care become raced and really focus on African American families beginning in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. So up until the Civil Rights Movement, foster care in the United States really was focused on white families. And it was largely voluntary. It was just there as a resource. So it was either for orphans, pre some of our advances in medicine in the middle of the 20th century, where you could die from a paper cut wound in the 1930s if it got infected. So So we saw foster care mainly being for orphans, which were a huge issue during the early 20th century, or for white families who were struggling and used it as a temporary solution. In the wake of the civil rights movement, when we see Black families in the United States beginning to also gain greater access to welfare funds, which is something that Black families had been largely denied up until the civil rights movement, then we start to see child welfare in the United States change. We see a great influx of federal funding. We start seeing the federal government requiring that if states want to receive this huge influx of funding, they need to start implementing mandatory reporting by teachers and doctors and social workers. And then at that point, we also see it move to an involuntary system. So it's similar to moves that we see with policing and jails in the wake of the civil rights movement and the end of at least explicit Jim Crow. So I'd say they're not the same issue, but they share a lot of parallels. And so I share all this to share one of, at least a unique issue. I'm not aware of any other Catholic worker communities right now that are working on the CPS issue, but it's something that we've become greatly involved in and feel that it's since we've become involved in it and learned more about it, and one of our members is dedicated exclusively to court support, it's something that we've wanted to share, that we feel isn't just a Milwaukee issue, but an issue that is a problem throughout the United States.